Imagine a city so sacred that three of the world's greatest religions call it home, a place where golden stones have witnessed prayers in Hebrew, Latin, and Arabic for over 2,000 years. Picture temple bells ringing alongside church chimes and the call to prayer, all echoing through ancient streets that should have been reduced to ash and memory centuries ago. But in our world, they were destroyed. The Romans came, the walls fell, and Jerusalem became a symbol of loss and exile. But what if that never happened? Welcome to Hidden Histories, where we explore the forbidden questions and alternative timelines that challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, history, and destiny. If you love journeys that reveal the secrets behind the world's greatest mysteries, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see religion, politics, and the very nature of divine intervention forever. Tonight, we step into a world where Jerusalem never fell, where the impossible became reality, and where the course of human civilization took a path so different that our own timeline seems like the alternate reality. This is the story of the city that defied empires, survived the impossible, and changed the fate of 3 billion believers. Chapter 1: The Holy City that Defied Empires. In the year 70 AD, Jerusalem stood as the crown jewel of the ancient world. Imagine walking through its massive gates as the morning sun painted the limestone walls in shades of gold and amber. The sound of your footsteps would mix with the voices of merchants from Egypt, pilgrims from Babylon, and Roman soldiers whose bronze armor caught the light like fire. The Second Temple rose before you like a mountain of white stone and gold, its walls so massive that a man could walk along their top as easily as a city street. Every morning at dawn, the smoke of sacrifices would curl upward, carrying the prayers of thousands toward heaven. The priests, dressed in pure white linen, moved through their sacred duties with the precision of a divine dance that had continued unbroken for centuries. But Jerusalem was more than just a religious center. It was a crossroads where East met West, where Roman engineering marveled at Jewish architecture, where Greek philosophy debated with Hebrew wisdom in the shadow of the Temple Mount. The markets bustled with the languages of a dozen nations. Spices from India mixed their scents with incense from Arabia. Silver from Spain lay beside silk from distant China. In the court of the Gentiles, visitors from across the known world gathered to witness something they could find nowhere else: a religion that claimed to know the one true God. Some came as skeptics, others as seekers. Many left as believers, carrying stories of miracles and divine encounters back to their homelands. This was the spiritual beating heart of the world, pumping faith and wonder to the furthest corners of the Roman Empire. Yet beneath this surface of prosperity and spiritual power, tensions simmered like oil ready to ignite. Roman governors grew increasingly frustrated with Jewish customs that seemed to challenge imperial authority. Jewish zealots preached rebellion against foreign occupation, their voices growing louder in the temple courts. The collision course between Roman military might and Jewish religious devotion seemed inevitable. The city that had survived Babylonian conquest, Persian rule, and Greek domination now faced its greatest test. Roman legions were already marching toward its walls, their siege engines creaking under the weight of imperial ambition. History had written the ending to this story. Jerusalem would fall, the temple would burn, and the Jewish people would scatter to the ends of the earth. But what if history was wrong? Chapter 2: The Point of No Return. The year was 66 AD, and the streets of Jerusalem crackled with an energy that made even the stones seem alive. In the court of the Gentiles, a young zealot named Eleazar stood before a growing crowd, his voice rising above the morning bustle. "How long will we bow to Rome?" he shouted, his words echoing off the temple walls. "How long will we pay tribute to Caesar while God's house stands empty of its proper glory?" The crowd murmured agreement, but their eyes darted nervously toward the Antonia fortress, where Roman soldiers watched from the ramparts. Governor Florus had already proven his brutality by seizing gold from the temple treasury. 17 talents of sacred gold, taken to fund Roman projects while Jewish children went hungry. The insult burned deeper than any sword wound. In the upper city, wealthy Jewish leaders met in secret chambers, their faces grave with the weight of impossible choices. "Rebellion means death," whispered Ananus, the former high priest. "But submission means the slow death of everything we hold sacred." Outside their windows, the temple gleamed in the afternoon sun, its golden facade reflecting light that had blessed this place since Solomon's time. Meanwhile, in distant Rome, Emperor Nero received reports that troubled his sleep. "The Jews grow restless," his advisors warned. "Small riots are becoming large protests. Temple worship is becoming a rallying cry for independence." Nero's response was swift and brutal. Send Vespasian, the empire's most skilled general, to crush this rebellion before it could spread. As spring turned to summer in 67 AD, the sound of marching feet echoed across the Judean hills. Roman legions moved like a great machine of war, their eagles glinting in the sun as they approached the city that had never truly been conquered. Behind Jerusalem's walls, families hugged their children tighter, priests offered extra sacrifices, and young men sharpened swords that had never tasted blood. The final diplomatic missions failed one by one. Roman demands for complete submission met Jewish insistence on religious freedom. Neither side could bend without breaking everything they believed in. As summer faded into autumn, scouts brought word that struck terror into every heart. Vespasian had surrounded the city. The siege of Jerusalem had begun. But in those final moments before the first stone was hurled from a Roman catapult, before the first arrow whistled through the air, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would shatter every prediction, defy every military calculation, and change the course of human history forever. The last peaceful sunset was painting the Jerusalem sky in shades of purple and gold, and nobody knew that this sunset would mark not the end of their world, but the beginning of a miracle. Chapter 3: The Miraculous Intervention. On the morning of what should have been Jerusalem's final day, the impossible happened. Roman catapults stood ready, their massive stones aimed at walls that had protected the holy city for centuries. Vespasian himself rode along the siege lines, his experienced eyes calculating the points where his engines would break through first. The attack was scheduled to begin at dawn, when the rising sun would blind the Jewish defenders on the walls. But as the first light crept over the Mount of Olives, something stopped the Roman war machine in its tracks. The accounts vary, but all agree on this. Something beyond human understanding intervened in that crucial moment. Some witnesses claimed the earth itself rebelled. Just as Vespasian raised his hand to signal the attack, a tremor ran through the ground. Not violent enough to topple buildings, but strong enough to shift every Roman siege engine just slightly off target. Catapults that had been aimed with mathematical precision now pointed harmlessly at empty air. Others reported a more direct divine intervention. A blinding light appeared above the temple, so bright that Roman soldiers threw down their shields and covered their eyes. When the light faded, every siege engine had mysteriously seized up. Their ropes snapped, their mechanisms jammed beyond repair. It would take weeks to rebuild them, weeks that would prove crucial. But perhaps the most remarkable account comes from Josephus himself, the Jewish historian who witnessed these events. He wrote of a vision that appeared to Vespasian in his command tent that very night. The Roman general saw himself not as a conqueror of Jerusalem, but as the future emperor of Rome. The vision promised him that his destiny lay not in destroying the holy city, but in preserving it as a testament to Roman mercy and divine favor. Whatever the true cause, the result was undeniable. The attack that should have begun at dawn was postponed. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. Roman soldiers who had been eager for battle began to mutter about cursed ground and angry gods. Discipline, the backbone of Roman military success, began to crack under the weight of supernatural uncertainty. Inside Jerusalem's walls, the mood shifted from despair to desperate hope. Priests proclaimed it a miracle, a sign that God had not abandoned his chosen people. Zealots saw it as divine approval for their resistance. Even the skeptical wealthy began to whisper that perhaps heaven itself had intervened. But the most significant change was in Vespasian himself. The hardened general who had crushed rebellions across the empire found himself haunted by dreams and visions. Night after night, he saw Jerusalem not in flames, but crowned with glory, its temple serving as a bridge between the divine and human worlds. These were not the dreams of a conqueror, but of a man chosen for a different destiny entirely. As summer approached, and news arrived from Rome that Nero had died and the empire was tearing itself apart in civil war, Vespasian made a decision that shocked his own officers. Instead of pressing the attack, he would negotiate. Instead of destroying Jerusalem, he would find a way to preserve it. The siege that should have ended in conquest would end in an unprecedented peace treaty that would echo through the centuries. The miracle of Jerusalem's survival was not just about military failure or divine intervention. It was about the moment when the impossible became possible, when the course of history bent like light around a star, creating a new timeline where faith and empire learned to coexist in ways that no one had ever imagined. Chapter 4: The Empire That Couldn't Conquer. News of the failed siege spread through the Roman Empire like wildfire, carried by merchants, soldiers, and messengers who could hardly believe what they were reporting. For the first time in memory, Roman legions had retreated without victory. The city that should have fallen in days had somehow survived months of siege, and now stood free while its would-be conqueror marched toward Rome to claim the imperial throne. In the marble halls of the Senate, aged politicians struggled to understand reports that made no military sense. How does an experienced general with 4 legions fail to take a single city? Demanded Senator Marcus Crassus, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. The answers varied wildly. Some blamed faulty intelligence, others pointed to divine intervention, but all agreed on one unsettling truth. Rome had discovered the limits of its power. Vespasian's own letters to the Senate painted a picture that challenged everything Romans believed about their destiny. "The city of Jerusalem," he wrote, "stands under the protection of forces beyond our understanding. To destroy it would bring no glory to Rome, but to preserve it through wise treaty will demonstrate that Roman strength lies not in destruction, but in the wisdom to recognize when conquest becomes folly. But not everyone in Rome accepted this new reality. General Titus, Vespasian's own son, argued fiercely for renewed assault. One city's resistance, he declared, if left unpunished, will inspire rebellion from Britain to Egypt. We must finish what we started, or lose the respect that keeps our empire together. His words found support among younger senators who saw Jerusalem's survival as a challenge to Roman dominance. The debate that followed would reshape Roman policy for generations. For the first time, the empire faced a decision about whether to persist in a military campaign that seemed to defy natural law. Some advisors suggested that Jerusalem's mysterious protection might actually serve Roman interests. A city that couldn't be conquered might prove to be a more valuable ally than a destroyed enemy. Meanwhile, in the eastern provinces, Roman governors watched nervously as local populations whispered about the miracle in Jerusalem. If the Jews could resist Rome and survive, what did that mean for other subject peoples? In Alexandria, Greek scholars debated whether divine forces truly opposed Roman expansion. In Antioch, Christian communities saw Jerusalem's preservation as a sign of divine favor for the Jewish people who had given birth to their faith. The psychological impact on Roman legions proved even more significant than the political consequences. Soldiers who had never questioned Roman invincibility now spoke in hushed tones about cursed cities and angry gods. Military discipline, built on absolute confidence in Roman superiority, began to show cracks that worried seasoned commanders. Some Roman units requested transfers rather than serve in Judea, claiming the region was haunted by supernatural forces. Others embraced local religions, seeking protection from powers that seemed stronger than Roman eagles. The legendary 10th Legion, veterans of countless victories, reported strange dreams and mysterious illnesses that their physicians couldn't explain or cure. Yet perhaps the most profound change occurred in Roman religious thinking. Traditional Roman gods had always been practical deities, gods of war, agriculture, and state success. But Jerusalem's survival suggested the existence of a different kind of divine power, one that couldn't be conquered, bargained with, or incorporated into the Roman pantheon. Temple priests in Rome found themselves fielding unprecedented questions from citizens who wanted to understand how foreign gods could challenge Roman might. Some Romans began secretly studying Jewish texts, seeking to understand the source of Jerusalem's mysterious protection. Others embraced Christianity, seeing in Jesus' teachings a bridge between Roman authority and the divine power that had saved Jerusalem. The empire that had conquered most of the known world discovered that some victories were impossible, some cities were beyond capture, and some powers were greater than imperial ambition. Jerusalem's survival forced Rome to reimagine itself, not as an unstoppable force of conquest, but as a civilization capable of wisdom, restraint, and coexistence with the miraculous. Chapter 5. A new covenant emerges. With Jerusalem intact and the temple still standing, Judaism found itself at a crossroads unlike any in its history. The destruction that had been prophesied, the exile that seemed inevitable, had simply failed to materialize. For the first time in centuries, Jewish religious leaders had to grapple with the question: what does it mean to be God's chosen people when God chooses to protect rather than punish? Inside the temple courts, heated debates raged between different schools of Jewish thought. The Pharisees, who had developed portable religious practices that could survive without the temple, suddenly found their innovations less urgent. Why create Judaism for exile when exile had been prevented? The Sadducees, who had tied their entire religious identity to temple worship, saw vindication in the miracle of Jerusalem's survival. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who in our timeline founded the academy at Yavne after Jerusalem's fall, instead established a new kind of religious institution within Jerusalem itself. His school became a bridge between temple-centered worship and the broader questions of Jewish law and ethics. God has given us a sign, he taught his students. We are meant not to scatter, but to remain, not to mourn, but to understand our purpose in this miraculous preservation. The implications rippled through Jewish communities across the Mediterranean world. In Alexandria, Babylon, and Rome, Jewish populations faced an unexpected choice. Many had prepared spiritually and practically for life in permanent exile, developing ways to maintain their faith far from the temple. Now, with Jerusalem preserved, should they return to the homeland that had been saved by divine intervention? Some did return, creating a reverse diaspora that brought new energy and ideas back to Jerusalem. Jewish scholars from Greek cities brought philosophical training that enriched temple debates. Merchants from Babylon contributed wealth that funded new construction and charitable works. The city that had barely survived siege now experienced a renaissance of population and ideas. But the most significant change came in Judaism's relationship with emerging Christianity. In our timeline, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple became a cornerstone of Christian theology, proof that God had rejected the Jewish people in favor of a new covenant through Jesus. With the temple still standing and sacrifices continuing, early Christian leaders faced a theological crisis. The Apostle Paul, still alive in this timeline, found his missionary message complicated by Jerusalem's survival. His letters to Gentile churches, which had emphasized Christianity's replacement of Judaism, now required careful revision. How could he argue that the Old Covenant was obsolete when God had so dramatically preserved its central institution? Some Christian communities saw Jerusalem's preservation as vindication of Jewish Christian unity. They argued that Jesus had come not to replace Judaism, but to fulfill it, and that the temple's survival proved God's continued favor toward the Jewish people. These groups developed a hybrid worship that combined Christian beliefs with temple practices, creating something entirely new in religious history. Other Christian leaders, particularly those who had never been Jews themselves, struggled with what Jerusalem's survival meant for their understanding of salvation history. If God had not rejected the Jews, what was Christianity's unique role? Some developed theologies that emphasized multiple paths to divine truth, while others insisted that Jerusalem's preservation was only temporary, a final chance for Jewish conversion to Christianity. The temple itself became a focal point for these theological struggles. Christian pilgrims began arriving in Jerusalem, seeking to understand Jesus' relationship to the place where he had taught and died. Some came expecting to find a defunct religion ready for replacement. Instead, they encountered a vibrant Jewish faith that seemed to have divine protection and approval. Jewish religious authorities faced the delicate task of managing these Christian visitors while maintaining their own religious integrity. Some welcomed the opportunity for dialogue and debate. Others worried that Christian ideas would contaminate traditional Jewish practice. The temple courts, designed for Jewish worship, became unexpected venues for interfaith encounter and theological exploration. This new reality forced both Judaism and Christianity to develop in ways neither had anticipated. Judaism, freed from the trauma of exile and destruction, could focus on questions of meaning and practice rather than mere survival. Christianity, unable to claim replacement of Judaism, had to articulate its distinct message in a world where both covenants seemed divinely blessed. The result was a religious landscape unlike anything in our historical experience. Two faiths sharing common roots and sacred space, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, but always forced to acknowledge each other's legitimacy by the undeniable fact of Jerusalem's miraculous preservation. Chapter 6: Christianity's Altered Path. The survival of Jerusalem created ripples through early Christian communities that would reshape the faith in ways unimaginable in our timeline. In Antioch, where followers of Jesus were first called Christians, believers gathered in heated discussion about what the temple's preservation meant for their understanding of God's plan. Peter, the rock upon which Jesus had promised to build his church, found himself returning to Jerusalem not as a visitor to ruins, but as a pilgrim to a living temple. Standing in the court of the Gentiles where Jesus had taught, Peter faced questions that had no precedent in Christian experience. If God had preserved the temple and its sacrificial system, what did that mean for Jesus' sacrifice on the cross? The early Christian community in Jerusalem, led by James, the brother of Jesus, took on renewed significance. In our timeline, this community dispersed after Jerusalem's destruction, allowing Gentile Christianity to dominate the movement's development. But with Jerusalem intact, Jewish Christians maintained a strong voice in defining what it meant to follow Jesus. These Jewish Christians developed a unique perspective that would profoundly influence all of Christianity. They argued that Jesus had not come to destroy the law and the temple, but to fulfill them in ways that made both more meaningful. Temple sacrifices continued, but now they were understood as pointing toward the ultimate sacrifice of Christ. Jewish holy days were celebrated alongside new Christian observances, creating a rich liturgical calendar that honored both traditions. Paul's missionary journeys took on different significance in this altered timeline. When he arrived in new cities to preach the gospel, he could no longer point to Jerusalem's destruction as evidence of God's judgment on Judaism. Instead, he had to explain how Christianity related to a Judaism that appeared to have divine favor and protection. This challenge led Paul to develop new theological arguments that emphasized Christianity's universal message without rejecting its Jewish foundations. His letters from this period show a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between law and gospel, between Jewish particularity and Christian universality. The temple stands, he wrote to the Romans, as a testimony that God's promises to Abraham remain unbroken, while Christ's resurrection proves that. These promises extend to all nations. The development of Christian doctrine took dramatically different turns in this environment. The early church councils, when they eventually met, faced questions about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism that had no easy answers. Some argued for complete separation, insisting that Christianity had superseded Judaism regardless of the temple's survival. Others pushed for integration, claiming that true Christianity must include Jewish law and practice. A third group, which would become increasingly influential, developed what they called fulfillment theology. They taught that Christianity was Judaism's completion rather than its replacement, that Jesus had come to expand God's covenant rather than to establish a new one. This perspective allowed for continued Jewish practice while embracing Christian beliefs about Jesus' divinity and saving work. The practical implications were enormous. Christian communities began adopting modified versions of Jewish practices, observing Sabbath alongside Sunday worship, celebrating Passover as well as Easter, maintaining some form of dietary laws. The distinctly Gentile character that Christianity developed in our timeline gave way to a more Jewish-influenced faith that maintained stronger connections to its origins. Missionary work also changed dramatically. Early Christians could no longer present themselves as the replacement for a failed Judaism. Instead, they had to articulate Christianity's unique contributions while acknowledging Judaism's continued validity. This led to more sophisticated theological arguments, but also to greater respect for Jewish traditions and practices. The preservation of Jerusalem also affected Christian attitudes toward pilgrimage and sacred space. In our timeline, Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land was largely about visiting historical sites and commemorating past events. But with the temple still functioning and Jerusalem thriving as a religious center, Christian pilgrims encountered a living tradition rather than archaeological remains. Some Christians were deeply moved by witnessing temple worship and seeing Judaism as a vibrant, ongoing faith. Others felt challenged or confused by the apparent contradiction between their beliefs about Christianity's supremacy and the evidence of divine favor toward Judaism. These encounters led to profound theological reflection and, in many cases, to revised understanding of God's relationship with different peoples and faiths. Perhaps most significantly, the survival of Jerusalem prevented Christianity from developing the supersessionist theology that would, in our timeline, contribute to centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. Unable to claim that God had rejected the Jews, Christian leaders were forced to develop more nuanced and respectful approaches to Jewish-Christian relations from the very beginning of their faith's history. The result was a Christianity that remained more Jewish in character, more respectful of its roots, and more aware of its place within, rather than above, the broader tradition of Abraham's children. Chapter 7: Islam's Transformed Genesis. 6 centuries after Jerusalem's miraculous preservation, the Arabian Peninsula trembled with the birth of a new revelation. Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the merchant from Mecca, received visions that would create the world's third great monotheistic faith. But in this timeline, Islam emerged into a Middle Eastern landscape that looked dramatically different from the one we know. When Muhammad experienced his night journey, the Isra and Miraj that carried him from Mecca to Jerusalem and then to heaven, he arrived not at the ruins of the Temple Mount, but at a living, breathing center of worship. The temple still stood in all its glory, its golden walls reflecting the celestial light that surrounded the prophet during his miraculous journey. This encounter with an intact temple profoundly influenced the revelations that would become the Quran. Instead of references to a destroyed sanctuary and a scattered people, the verses spoke of Judaism as a living tradition that had earned divine protection. "Behold," reads one passage unique to this timeline, "the house that God preserved when armies gathered against it, for those who served faithfully, kept their covenant, and their prayers rose like incense before the throne of glory." The early Muslim community's relationship with Jews and Christians took on characteristics unknown in our history. When Muslim armies first approached Jerusalem in 638 AD, they encountered not a recently conquered Byzantine city, but a thriving multi-religious center where Jewish temple worship had continued unbroken for nearly 6 centuries since the Roman siege. The Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab faced an unprecedented situation. Islamic tradition held that Jerusalem was sacred to Muslims because of Muhammad's night journey. But how should they approach a city where Jewish worship had demonstrably received divine protection? The negotiations that followed would establish patterns of interfaith relations entirely different from those in our timeline. Rather than simply conquering and administering Jerusalem as another Muslim city, Umar negotiated the Treaty of Sacred Preservation. This remarkable document recognized 3 zones of religious authority in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount remained under Jewish administration, Christian holy sites stayed in Christian hands, and Muslims were granted the right to build their own places of worship in designated areas of the city. The construction of the Dome of the Rock took on different significance in this context. Instead of being built on the ruins of the Jewish temple, it was constructed as a complement to the existing sanctuary. Islamic architects designed it to honor both Muhammad's night journey and the ongoing Jewish worship at the site. The result was an architectural dialogue between faiths rather than a replacement of one tradition by another. This arrangement created opportunities for theological exchange that transformed all 3 religions. Muslim scholars gained direct access to Jewish texts and traditions that had been preserved continuously in Jerusalem. They developed sophisticated understandings of Hebrew scripture and Jewish law that enriched Islamic jurisprudence and theology. The great Islamic scholar Al-Tabari, working in this environment, produced commentaries on the Quran that showed deep familiarity with Jewish interpretive traditions. His work demonstrated how Islamic revelation both honored and transcended the Jewish tradition, rather than simply replacing it. The Quran, he wrote, is the final revelation, but it builds upon foundations that God himself chose to preserve in Jerusalem. Christian communities in the Islamic world also benefited from this new dynamic. With Judaism still present as a living tradition, Christians could not be dismissed as simply the remnant of a superseded faith. Muslim rulers developed policies that recognized Christianity's legitimate place in God's plan, while maintaining Islam's position as the final revelation. The famous Islamic doctrine of Ahl al-Kitab, people of the book, took on richer meaning in a world where both Jewish and Christian traditions maintained visible divine favor. Rather than being grudgingly tolerated as inferior predecessors to Islam, Jews and Christians were recognized as ongoing partners in humanity's relationship with the one God. Islamic mysticism, particularly the Sufi tradition, developed in fascinating ways through encounter with Jewish mystical practices that had continued unbroken in Jerusalem. Sufi masters studied Kabbalistic texts and incorporated modified versions of Jewish meditation techniques into their spiritual practices. The result was a more diverse and sophisticated Islamic spirituality that acknowledged wisdom traditions beyond purely Islamic sources. The annual Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca took on additional meaning for Muslims who had also visited Jerusalem. Many pilgrims made both journeys, creating a spiritual geography that connected Mecca's role as Islam's birthplace with Jerusalem's significance as the site of Muhammad's night journey and ongoing interfaith encounter. Perhaps most remarkably, this Islamic encounter with living Judaism and Christianity prevented the development of some of the more exclusivist interpretations of Islam that emerged in our timeline. Unable to point to the destruction of Jewish and Christian centers as evidence of divine displeasure with those faiths, Muslim theologians were forced to develop more nuanced understandings of religious truth and divine favor. The Islam that emerged from this environment was still confident in its message and committed to its expansion, but it was also more respectful of other traditions and more sophisticated in its understanding of how different revelations might work together in God's plan for humanity. Chapter 8: The Crusades That Never Were. The medieval period arrived with a Middle Eastern landscape so transformed that the great military expeditions we know as the Crusades simply had no basis for existence. In our timeline, European Christians launched 8 major crusading campaigns to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, driven by a narrative of Christian sites lost to infidel conquest. But in this alternative history, that narrative had no foundation in reality. By the year 1095, when Pope Urban II historically preached the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont, Jerusalem had been successfully shared between Christians, Jews, and Muslims for over 4 centuries. The city that Europeans imagined as lost to Islamic conquest was actually a thriving center of interfaith cooperation, where pilgrims from all 3 traditions traveled freely and worshipped according to their beliefs. Reports reaching European courts described not a city under siege, but a remarkable experiment in religious coexistence. Merchants returning from Jerusalem told stories that seemed almost fantastical to medieval European minds. Jewish priests conducting temple sacrifices, while Christian bells rang for morning prayers and Muslim calls to prayer echoed from elegant minarets. Instead of conflict, they described collaboration. The absence of the Crusades created ripple effects that reshaped all of medieval Europe. The military orders that formed to fight in the Holy Land, the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, either never formed at all or developed entirely different purposes. The enormous wealth that European nobles spent on crusading expeditions remained in Europe, funding different kinds of projects. Instead of military campaigns, European Christianity developed what historians call the Great Pilgrimage Movement. Beginning in the late 11th century, unprecedented numbers of Christian pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem not as conquerors, but as religious seekers. These pilgrims returned with reports of Jewish and Islamic scholarship that challenged European intellectual assumptions and sparked what some historians call the First Renaissance, centuries earlier than in our timeline. The University of Paris, founded in this timeline partly to study texts brought back from Jerusalem, became a center for interfaith scholarship unprecedented in medieval Europe. Christian theologians studied Jewish commentaries on Hebrew scripture, while Islamic philosophical works entered European intellectual life much earlier and more systematically than in our history. Economic effects were equally dramatic. The Mediterranean trade routes that were disrupted by crusading warfare in our timeline remained stable and profitable. Venice and Genoa became even wealthier as they facilitated peaceful trade between Europe and the Middle East. The banking systems that developed to finance crusades instead emerged to support international pilgrimage and scholarship. The absence of the Crusades also meant that the bitter religious hatreds they generated never took root. Without the traumatic memories of Christian-Muslim warfare, without the religious violence that scarred both traditions, medieval European attitudes toward Islam and Judaism developed along different lines entirely. Some European nobles, frustrated by the lack of military opportunities in the Holy Land, redirected their energies toward other frontiers. The Reconquista in Spain proceeded differently, with less religious fervor and more emphasis on political control. The expansion into Eastern Europe took on different characteristics, sometimes more diplomatic and less violently missionary in approach. The papacy, deprived of the unifying cause that the Crusades provided in our timeline, faced different challenges in asserting its authority over European Christianity. Without the special spiritual status that came from organizing holy wars, popes had to find other ways to demonstrate their leadership of the Christian world. This led to what historians call the Papal Scholarship Initiative, where the papacy became a patron of learning and interfaith dialogue rather than military expedition. The Vatican Library began acquiring texts in Hebrew and Arabic much earlier, and papal universities were established to train Christian scholars in multiple religious traditions. The effects on popular culture were equally significant. The literature of chivalry developed without the crusading ideal as its central theme. Instead of stories about Christian knights battling Muslim infidels, medieval romance evolved around themes of pilgrimage, spiritual quest, and interfaith encounter. The Arthurian legends, when they emerged, incorporated themes of seeking wisdom from diverse spiritual traditions rather than conquering foreign lands. Perhaps most importantly, the absence of the Crusades prevented the development of the siege mentality that characterized medieval European Christianity in our timeline. Instead of seeing themselves as a faith under attack, requiring military defense against hostile neighbors, European Christians developed more confident and open attitudes toward other religions. This openness created the intellectual and spiritual foundations for developments that would transform the late medieval period. When Renaissance humanism eventually emerged, it built upon centuries of interfaith encounter and exchange. When the printing press was invented, among the first texts mass-produced were Hebrew and Arabic works that had been circulating in European intellectual circles for generations. The world that entered the Renaissance period was one where the great monotheistic faiths had learned to coexist, compete intellectually rather than militarily, and share the sacred geography that gave birth to all three traditions. It was a world where Jerusalem's miraculous preservation had prevented centuries of religious warfare and created possibilities for human spiritual development that our timeline never experienced. Chapter 9: The Renaissance of Three Faiths. The Renaissance that bloomed across Europe in this timeline carried the fragrance of three great traditions rather than the bitter smoke of religious warfare. When Leonardo da Vinci sketched his famous anatomical drawings, he worked from medical texts that had been translated from Arabic in Jerusalem's interfaith scriptoriums. When Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he incorporated symbolic elements drawn from Jewish mystical traditions he had encountered through Florentine scholars who had studied in the Holy Land. Florence, Venice, and Rome buzzed with intellectual excitement as manuscripts in Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin flowed freely between Jerusalem and European centers of learning. The Medici family's private library contained not only classical Greek and Roman texts, but also the most complete collection of Jewish philosophical works outside of Jerusalem itself. Lorenzo de' Medici's famous gatherings included not only Christian humanists, but also Jewish scholars and Islamic philosophers who traveled from the Holy Land to participate in unprecedented intellectual exchanges. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg around 1440, revolutionized not just European literacy, but interfaith understanding. Among the first books mass-produced were Hebrew Psalms with parallel Latin translations, Islamic poetry rendered into vernacular European languages, and philosophical works that showed the common foundations underlying different religious traditions. These books reached audiences far beyond scholarly circles, creating a popular Renaissance culture that was genuinely multicultural. Artists of this period produced works impossible in our timeline. In Jerusalem itself, a new school of religious art emerged that honored all three traditions while remaining faithful to each faith's requirements. Islamic geometric patterns influenced Jewish ceremonial objects, while Christian iconographic traditions inspired new forms of Islamic calligraphy. The result was an artistic renaissance that celebrated religious diversity rather than denominational purity. The scientific revolution took on different characteristics in this environment. When Copernicus proposed his heliocentric model of the universe, he could draw not only on Greek astronomical texts, but also on Islamic astronomical observations that had been preserved and expanded in Damascus and Baghdad, as well as Jewish mathematical traditions that had continued, unbroken in Jerusalem. Science emerged from the dialogue between traditions rather than from the isolation of any single culture. European universities established exchange programs with centers of learning in Jerusalem, Cairo, and Baghdad. Students could study Jewish law at the University of Paris, Islamic philosophy at Oxford, and Christian theology in Damascus. The result was a generation of scholars who understood their own traditions more deeply because they had encountered them in dialogue with others. The Renaissance ideal of the universal man took on new meaning in this context. Instead of mastery over secular subjects alone, the educated person was expected to understand the major religious and philosophical traditions that shaped human civilization. Pico della Mirandola's famous Oration on the Dignity of Man quoted not only from Christian and classical sources, but also from the Talmud, the Quran, and mystical texts from all three traditions. This intellectual ferment created new forms of religious expression within each tradition. Christianity developed more sophisticated understandings of its relationship to Judaism and Islam. The Christian humanists didn't see these faiths as obstacles to be overcome, but as conversation partners that could illuminate different aspects of divine truth. Jewish communities across Europe experienced a golden age of creativity and acceptance. No longer forced into defensive positions by crusading hostility, Jewish scholars could engage openly with Christian and Islamic thought. The result was a flowering of Jewish philosophy, mysticism, and literary achievement that enriched European culture broadly. Islamic influence on European thought, which had been limited to Spain and Sicily in our timeline, now extended across the continent. Islamic mathematical and scientific advances, preserved and developed in the continuing Islamic presence in Jerusalem and other Middle Eastern centers, flowed freely into European intellectual life. The Renaissance courts became centers of interfaith encounter. Isabella d'Este's court in Mantua regularly hosted Jewish musicians, Islamic scholars, and Christian theologians in the same gatherings. The Sforza court in Milan commissioned works from artists of all three traditions, creating a patron-art relationship that crossed religious boundaries. This cultural transformation had profound effects on European politics as well. Kings and princes, who had previously defined their legitimacy partly through opposition to religious others, now had to demonstrate their sophistication through openness to diverse traditions. Royal libraries competed to acquire the most comprehensive collections of interfaith texts. The result was a Europe that entered the modern period with very different assumptions about religious truth, cultural superiority, and the relationship between faith and reason. Instead of the religious wars that would devastate Europe in our timeline, this Renaissance created foundations for a more peaceful and collaborative approach to religious difference. When this Renaissance Europe eventually encountered the New World, it brought with it attitudes shaped by centuries of interfaith dialogue rather than religious exclusivity. The encounter between European and indigenous American traditions would unfold very differently in a world where Europeans had already learned to see religious diversity as a source of enrichment rather than a threat to be eliminated. Chapter 10: Enlightenment's Sacred Paradox. The 17th and 18th centuries brought the Age of Enlightenment crashing against a reality that defied its most basic assumptions. In coffeehouses from London to Vienna, philosophers and scientists struggled to reconcile their commitment to rational explanation with the undeniable fact of Jerusalem's impossible survival. How could pure reason account for a city that had been preserved for 17 centuries when every military calculation suggested it should have fallen? Voltaire, the great champion of reason over superstition, found himself wrestling with reports from Jerusalem that challenged his worldview. In his private correspondence, he wrote, "I have devoted my life to exposing the frauds of organized religion. Yet what am I to make of this city, where three faiths coexist under what can only be called miraculous protection? My reason rebels against supernatural explanations, yet my honesty compels me to acknowledge that natural explanations seem insufficient." The famous salons of Paris became venues for heated debates about the Jerusalem question. Madame de Pompadour hosted evenings where the greatest minds of Europe attempted to explain how a small Middle Eastern city had defied the Roman Empire, survived the rise of Islam, and continued to thrive when logic suggested it should have been destroyed dozens of times over. Diderot's Encyclopedia, that great monument to Enlightenment learning, contained what may be the most remarkable entry of the entire project. The article on Jerusalem spans nearly 50 pages and represents the collective attempt of Europe's greatest thinkers to explain the unexplainable. It contains detailed maps, historical analyses, military assessments, and theological speculations, but concludes with a rare admission of intellectual defeat. We present these facts to our readers and confess ourselves unable to provide a satisfactory rational explanation for them. The scientific revolution took on additional urgency as natural philosophers sought to discover physical laws that might account for Jerusalem's preservation. Sir Isaac Newton, whose mathematical principles had explained the motion of planets and the behavior of light, spent his later years developing what he called divine mechanics, an attempt to discover the natural laws through which supernatural protection might operate. Newton's private papers, discovered centuries later, revealed his theory that certain locations on Earth might serve as nodes of divine intervention, where the normal laws of cause and effect could be temporarily suspended by higher-order principles. He conducted extensive correspondence with scholars in Jerusalem, requesting detailed measurements and observations that might provide clues to the mechanism of the city's protection. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant found in Jerusalem a perfect example for his philosophical system. In his Critique of Pure Reason, he used the city's survival as evidence for the limits of human understanding. That Jerusalem stands, he wrote, proves that phenomena exist which pure reason cannot fully comprehend, yet which practical reason must acknowledge as real and significant. But perhaps the most significant Enlightenment response to Jerusalem came from John Locke's theories of religious tolerance. Observing how three major faiths had coexisted in Jerusalem for centuries, Locke developed arguments for religious freedom that went far beyond the grudging tolerance common in his era. His letter concerning toleration used Jerusalem as a practical demonstration that religious diversity, far from leading to chaos, could actually create stability and prosperity. The Enlightenment's encounter with Jerusalem also sparked new developments in historical methodology. Scholars realized that understanding the city's preservation required new approaches to evidence and explanation. They began developing what would later be called anomaly studies, systematic approaches to investigating historical events that seem to defy normal patterns of cause and effect. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire contained an entire chapter devoted to the failure at Jerusalem, which analyzed the siege from multiple perspectives: military, political, psychological, and theological. Gibbon's conclusion that forces beyond historical analysis were clearly at work marked a rare instance of an Enlightenment historian acknowledging the limits of rational historical explanation. The economic implications of Jerusalem's survival also attracted Enlightenment attention. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations examined how the city's unique status as a shared religious center had created economic opportunities impossible in a more conventional political arrangement. The constant flow of pilgrims from 3 different faith traditions had generated prosperity that lasted for centuries, creating what Smith called the Jerusalem model of economic development through religious diversity. Scientific expeditions to Jerusalem became common during this period. The Royal Society of London, the French Academy of Sciences, and similar institutions across Europe sponsored research trips designed to study the city's unusual characteristics. These expeditions produced detailed maps, architectural studies, demographic analyses, and even primitive archaeological investigations. The results of these scientific studies only deepened the mystery. Researchers found evidence of the Roman siege works that should have breached the city's defenses, yet the walls had somehow remained intact. They discovered layers of construction and reconstruction that suggested the city had faced multiple existential threats over the centuries, yet had survived them all through means that remained unclear. Perhaps most intriguingly, several expeditions reported what they called temporal anomalies, instances where their careful measurements of the city's dimensions, population, or other characteristics seemed to change between observations in ways that violated the principle of consistent physical reality. The Enlightenment's encounter with Jerusalem forced European intellectual culture to develop more nuanced understandings of the relationship between reason and faith, between natural law and supernatural possibility. By the end of the 18th century, the intellectual foundations had been laid for a more complex modern world, one where scientific rationality coexisted with acknowledgement that some realities transcended purely material explanation. This intellectual revolution would prove crucial when European civilization encountered the dramatic changes of the 19th and 20th centuries. Having learned to live with sacred mystery at the heart of rational inquiry, European culture was better prepared for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Chapter 11: The Hidden Scrolls of Continuous Tradition. Deep beneath the Temple Mount, in chambers that had never been abandoned or forgotten, lay treasures that would revolutionize religious scholarship. Unlike our timeline, where the destruction of Jerusalem scattered and destroyed countless ancient texts, this preserved city had maintained unbroken custody of manuscripts that most scholars believed were lost forever. In 1947, the same year that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in our timeline, Jerusalem's temple authorities made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the academic world. They revealed the existence of the Temple Archive, a vast underground library that had been continuously maintained by priestly families for nearly 2,000 years. The archive contained texts that challenged everything scholars thought they knew about early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There were complete versions of books mentioned in the Bible but never found, alternative gospels that had been preserved alongside canonical Christian texts, and early Islamic manuscripts that showed the development of Quranic interpretation in ways impossible to trace in our timeline. Among the most startling discoveries was a complete copy of the Book of Jasher, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible but lost in our history. This version contained detailed accounts of events only briefly described in canonical scripture, including alternative perspectives on the stories of Abraham, Moses, and David that had been preserved in continuous Jewish tradition. Even more controversial were the Christian texts found in the archive. The Gospel of Thomas existed not as fragments discovered in Egyptian caves, but as a complete manuscript that had been copied and studied alongside the canonical Gospels for centuries. Jewish Christian scribes had preserved it as part of the legitimate record of Jesus' teachings, creating theological debates that had no parallel in our timeline. The archive also contained what scholars called the Jerusalem Talmud Suprema, extended versions of Talmudic discussions that had continued unbroken in Jerusalem while the better-known Babylonian Talmud was being compiled in exile. These texts showed how Jewish law and thought had developed when rooted in continuous temple practice rather than adapted for diaspora life. Islamic scholars were equally amazed by the archive's contents. Early hadith collections existed in versions that had been preserved through direct transmission in Jerusalem, offering insights into the Prophet Muhammad's teachings that had been filtered through different cultural and geographical contexts in our timeline. The Jerusalem versions often provided crucial context that clarified disputed interpretations. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was a collection of texts that appeared to be interfaith commentaries, documents where Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scholars had worked together to understand shared scriptural traditions. These collaborations, dating from as early as the 8th century, showed sophisticated theological dialogue that challenged assumptions about historical religious relationships. The texts revealed that the three traditions had engaged in far more substantive intellectual exchange than anyone had imagined. Christian scholars had contributed to Jewish understanding of messianic prophecy, while Jewish exegetes had helped Christians understand Hebrew scripture in its original context. Islamic scholars had served as bridges between the traditions, offering linguistic and historical insights that enriched both Jewish and Christian interpretation. One particularly fascinating document, dubbed the Covenant of Understanding, appeared to be a formal agreement between religious authorities from all three traditions, establishing protocols for shared interpretation of disputed biblical passages. The document, dated to 847 CE, created procedures for interfaith theological dialogue that had operated continuously for over a millennium. The archive also contained astronomical, mathematical, and medical texts that showed how scientific knowledge had been preserved and developed through interfaith collaboration. Jewish scholars had preserved Greek mathematical works. Christian scribes had maintained Islamic astronomical observations, and Muslim scholars had translated and expanded upon Hebrew medical traditions. The revelation of the temple archive created both opportunities and controversies. Religious traditionalists within each faith worried that ancient interfaith collaboration might undermine contemporary claims to exclusive truth. Progressive scholars celebrated the evidence of historical cooperation and mutual enrichment between traditions. Universities around the world established Jerusalem studies programs to analyze the archive's contents. The Vatican, various Protestant denominations, Islamic institutions, and Jewish seminaries all sent scholars to participate in the massive translation and interpretation project that would take decades to complete. The archive's existence also raised profound questions about religious authority and interpretation. If these texts had been preserved continuously by legitimate religious authorities in Jerusalem, how should their alternative readings and interpretations be weighted against established traditions? Did continuous preservation in the Holy City give these texts special authority? Some religious leaders argued that the archive represented corruption of pure traditions through excessive interfaith contact. Others maintained that it revealed the authentic development of religious thought in its original geographical and cultural context. The debates that followed would reshape theological education and religious practice across all three traditions. The psychological impact proved equally significant. Believers who had grown up assuming that their traditions had developed in isolation from other faiths suddenly confronted evidence of extensive historical collaboration. Some found this troubling, feeling that it challenged their faith's uniqueness. Others found it inspiring, seeing it as evidence of underlying spiritual unity. The Temple Archive forced scholars and believers alike to reconsider fundamental questions about religious truth, historical development, and the relationship between different paths to divine understanding. The scrolls that had been hidden in Jerusalem's depths for centuries emerged to illuminate possibilities for faith and scholarship that neither tradition had imagined in isolation. Chapter 12. The Great Theological Debates. The Great Hall of Solomon, a magnificent chamber within the temple complex that had hosted religious discussions for centuries, became the stage for theological encounters that would reshape human understanding of divine truth. With representatives of three major world religions maintaining permanent presence in Jerusalem, debates that might have remained theoretical in other contexts became urgent practical necessities. The first recorded formal debate occurred in 789 CE, when Caliph Harun al-Rashid visited Jerusalem and requested a discussion between his Islamic scholars, the Jewish high priest, and Christian bishops who maintained churches in the city. The topic was seemingly simple. What does it mean to serve the one God? The answers proved anything but simple. Rabbi Eleazar ben Azariah represented the Jewish position, arguing that service to God required adherence to the commandments given to Moses, maintained through continuous temple worship and the study of Torah. God chose Abraham and gave the law to Moses, he declared. Our preservation in this city proves that our covenant remains unbroken and our service acceptable. Bishop Sophronius of Jerusalem spoke for the Christians, maintaining that service to God required recognition of Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God. The temple stands, he acknowledged, but it points beyond itself to the ultimate sacrifice of Christ. Jewish worship continues by God's mercy, but true service requires faith in the one who fulfilled all righteousness. The Islamic scholar Al-Kindi presented the Muslim perspective. Both traditions contain divine truth, but the final revelation came through Muhammad, peace be upon him. The preservation of Jerusalem demonstrates God's mercy toward all people of the book, but complete submission requires acceptance of the Quran as the final guidance. The debate continued for 3 days, with each participant presenting scriptural evidence, logical arguments, and appeals to historical experience. Remarkably, no side claimed complete victory. Instead, they produced what became known as the Jerusalem Accord, a document acknowledging that each tradition contained authentic elements of divine truth while maintaining their distinctive claims. This pattern of respectful but serious theological engagement continued for centuries. The Second Great Debate, held in 1154, addressed the problem of suffering and divine justice. Jewish participants drew on their experience of preservation despite persecution. Christian representatives examined suffering through the lens of Christ's passion, and Muslim scholars explored the concept of divine testing and mercy. The Third Great Debate, convened in 1347 during the Black Death, tackled questions of divine providence and human responsibility in the face of catastrophe. With plague devastating Europe but largely sparing Jerusalem, the theological implications seemed urgent and practical rather than merely academic. The debates also created new forms of theological literature. Participants began writing treatises that anticipated and addressed arguments from other traditions, leading to more sophisticated and comprehensive theological systems. The famous Jewish philosopher Maimonides, working in this environment, produced works that showed deep familiarity with Christian and Islamic thought while advancing distinctively Jewish positions. Similarly, Thomas Aquinas visited Jerusalem during his formative years and engaged directly with Jewish and Islamic scholars. His systematic theology showed influences from these encounters, particularly in his understanding of natural law and divine providence. His work represented not just Christian theology, but Christian theology that had been refined through engagement with other traditions. The Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali spent several years in Jerusalem studying Jewish mystical texts and Christian monastic practices. His influential works on Islamic spirituality incorporated insights drawn from these encounters while remaining authentically Islamic in their foundations and conclusions. Perhaps most remarkably, the debates produced collaborative works that no single tradition could have created alone. The Jerusalem Commentary on Abraham brought together Jewish, Christian, and Islamic perspectives on the patriarch, whom all three traditions claimed as their spiritual ancestor. The resulting work offered insights into Abraham's significance that none of the traditions had developed independently. The theological debates also had practical implications for daily life in Jerusalem. When disputes arose about religious practices, commercial relationships, or civil governance, the established patterns of respectful theological dialogue provided models for resolution. The city developed legal and social institutions that could accommodate religious diversity while maintaining order and justice. Not all debates ended in harmony. The great controversy of 1204 over the nature of divine revelation led to a temporary breakdown in interfaith relations and the establishment of separate quarters for each religious community. The debate of 1453, sparked by the fall of Constantinople and its implications for Christian-Muslim relations, created tensions that took decades to resolve. But even these failures taught important lessons about the limits and possibilities of theological dialogue. Participants learned to distinguish between core beliefs that could not be compromised and peripheral issues where accommodation was possible. They developed protocols for managing disagreement without abandoning the relationship. The Jerusalem debates created intellectual traditions that influenced religious development far beyond the city itself. European universities began incorporating comparative theological study into their curricula. Islamic madrasas developed new approaches to understanding the relationship between Islam and other revelations. Jewish yeshivas expanded their scope to include engagement with non-Jewish religious thought. By the modern period, the theological debates of Jerusalem had established patterns of interfaith engagement that provided models for religious dialogue worldwide. The city that had been preserved through miraculous intervention had become a laboratory for exploring how different paths to divine truth might coexist, compete, and mutually enrich each other. Chapter 13. Alternative sacred texts. In the scriptoriums of Jerusalem, where Jewish scribes worked alongside Christian copyists and Islamic calligraphers, a remarkable literary tradition emerged that existed nowhere else in the world. Texts that had been declared heretical, apocryphal, or simply lost in other contexts were preserved, studied, and developed as part of the living religious traditions that shared the Holy City. The Gospel of Philip, known in our timeline only through fragments discovered in Egypt, existed in Jerusalem as a complete manuscript that had been continuously copied and studied by Jewish Christian communities. This text, which explored the mystical dimensions of Jesus' teachings and his relationship with Mary Magdalene, offered perspectives on Christian origins that had been suppressed in mainstream Christianity, but preserved in Jerusalem's unique interfaith environment. Even more startling was the existence of what scholars called the Jerusalem Quranic variants, early versions of Islamic texts that showed the development of Quranic interpretation in dialogue with Jewish and Christian scholars. These manuscripts contained marginal notes and alternative readings that reflected the interfaith discussions that had shaped Islamic understanding in its original geographical context. The Jewish community had preserved texts that were even more controversial. The Book of Enoch existed not as the fragmentary Ethiopian version known to most scholars, but as a complete Hebrew manuscript that had been maintained as part of legitimate Jewish mystical tradition. This text, with its elaborate descriptions of heavenly realms and angelic hierarchies, had influenced both Christian and Islamic mystical traditions in ways that were impossible to trace in our timeline. Perhaps most remarkably, the Jerusalem archives contained what appeared to be collaborative scriptural commentaries, texts where scholars from all three traditions had worked together to understand shared biblical narratives. The Tri-Faith Commentary on Genesis brought together Jewish midrash, Christian typological interpretation, and Islamic qisas traditions to create a comprehensive understanding of creation stories that no single tradition could have developed alone. These collaborative texts revealed theological insights that challenged conventional understanding of religious boundaries. The commentary on the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, for example, incorporated the Islamic tradition that identified the intended sacrifice as Ishmael rather than Isaac, creating an interpretation that honored both versions while exploring their deeper spiritual significance. The Jerusalem Psalter represented another unique development. While maintaining the traditional 150 psalms, this version included additional compositions that had been created through interfaith liturgical collaboration. Some psalms incorporated Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Arabic verses, creating multilingual worship texts that could be used by all three communities while respecting each tradition's linguistic preferences. The preservation of Gnostic Christian texts in Jerusalem created particularly intense scholarly debates. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and other works that mainstream Christianity had rejected were maintained as legitimate parts of the Christian textual tradition by Jewish Christian communities that had never fully separated from their Jewish roots. These texts offered alternative perspectives on familiar Christian doctrines. The Gospel of Thomas emphasized the kingdom of heaven as a present spiritual reality rather than a future eschatological hope. The Gospel of Mary presented Mary Magdalene as a primary apostolic authority, challenging traditional assumptions about early Christian leadership. Islamic scholars in Jerusalem had access to hadith collections that had been preserved through different chains of transmission than those available elsewhere. The Jerusalem Hadith often provided crucial context for understanding the Prophet Muhammad's teachings, particularly regarding relations with Jewish and Christian communities. Some of these alternative Islamic texts suggested that the Prophet had envisioned more extensive cooperation between the three Abrahamic traditions than later Islamic development had emphasized. References to the Covenant of the Children of Abraham appeared in Jerusalem manuscripts, but were absent from collections compiled in other Islamic centers. The Jewish mystical tradition had also developed in unique directions. Kabbalistic texts that existed only in fragments elsewhere were preserved complete in Jerusalem, and new mystical works had been created through dialogue with Christian and Islamic spiritual traditions. The Jerusalem Zohar contained passages that showed clear influence from Christian mystical theology and Islamic spiritual practices. These alternative texts created both opportunities and challenges for religious authorities. Progressive scholars celebrated the evidence of historical interfaith cooperation and the theological insights that emerged from collaborative interpretation. Conservative leaders worried that alternative texts might undermine established religious authority and traditional interpretations. The Vatican established a special commission to evaluate the Christian texts preserved in Jerusalem, trying to determine their relationship to canonical scripture and Orthodox doctrine. Some Catholic scholars argued that the Jerusalem manuscripts represented corrupted Christianity that had been overly influenced by Jewish and Islamic ideas. Others maintained that they preserved authentic early Christian traditions that had been lost elsewhere. Protestant denominations had varied responses to the Jerusalem texts. Some evangelical groups rejected them entirely as incompatible with biblical authority. Others found in them support for more mystical or contemplative approaches to Christian faith that had been marginalized in mainstream Protestantism. Islamic authorities faced similar challenges. Some scholars argued that the Jerusalem Islamic texts represented innovations that had corrupted pure Islamic tradition through excessive contact with other faiths. Others maintained that they preserved authentic early Islamic understanding that had been lost in other contexts. Jewish responses were equally complex. Orthodox authorities generally maintained that continuous preservation in Jerusalem gave these texts special legitimacy, while reform and conservative movements found in them support for more open approaches to interfaith relations and religious interpretation. The alternative sacred texts of Jerusalem forced all three traditions to reconsider fundamental questions about scriptural authority, religious development, and the relationship between pure tradition and historical adaptation. The texts that had been preserved in the Holy City offered glimpses of what religious development might have looked like under different historical circumstances. These discoveries also raised profound questions about divine providence and religious truth. If God had preserved Jerusalem and its religious communities, did that divine protection extend to the alternative texts they had maintained? Were these variants part of divine revelation, or were they human innovations that had been accidentally preserved alongside authentic tradition? The alternative sacred texts of Jerusalem represented perhaps the most significant challenge to conventional religious scholarship in centuries, offering both opportunities for deeper understanding and risks of theological confusion that religious communities worldwide struggle to evaluate and integrate. Chapter 14. The Interfaith Councils. The council chamber of the three traditions, built in 1187 as a neutral space for interfaith dialogue, witnessed some of the most remarkable religious gatherings in human history. Constructed with architectural elements from all three traditions, Islamic geometric patterns, Christian iconographic symbols, and Jewish ceremonial designs, the chamber itself embodied the unprecedented cooperation that Jerusalem's unique circumstances had made possible. The First Council of Three Faiths, convened in 1215, addressed the urgent question of how religious communities should respond to the growing influence of Aristotelian philosophy being transmitted from Greek sources through Islamic scholarship. Jewish rabbis, Christian bishops, and Islamic qadis gathered to discuss whether reason and revelation could be reconciled without compromising either tradition's integrity. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, known to Christians and Muslims as Maimonides, argued for the Jewish position that rational inquiry could strengthen rather than weaken faith when properly guided by scriptural revelation. His systematic approach to harmonizing Aristotelian philosophy with Jewish theology provided a model that influenced both Christian and Islamic participants. The Christian representative, Bishop Albert of Jerusalem, drew on the emerging scholastic tradition to argue that reason was a divine gift that could illuminate revelation when properly employed. His position, influenced by his dialogue with Jewish and Islamic scholars, would later contribute to the development of Thomistic theology. The Islamic scholar Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, presented sophisticated arguments for the compatibility of philosophical inquiry with Quranic revelation. His work in the Jerusalem context, engaging directly with Jewish and Christian philosophical traditions, produced insights that influenced Islamic thought for centuries. The First Council produced the Concordat of Reason and Revelation, a document that established principles for intellectual inquiry that all three traditions could accept. While maintaining each faith's distinctive claims, the Concordat acknowledged that rational investigation of natural and moral questions could be pursued collaboratively without compromising religious commitment. The Second Council, held in 1274, tackled the more difficult question of religious practice and social organization. How could three communities with different dietary laws, worship schedules, and civil requirements coexist in a single city without compromising their distinctive traditions? The solutions developed were remarkably creative. The council established the principle of reciprocal accommodation. Each community would adjust its practices in minor ways to facilitate the religious life of the others, while maintaining the essential elements of their own traditions. Jewish markets would remain open during Christian holy days when possible, while Christian merchants would respect Jewish Sabbath restrictions. Islamic prayer times would be coordinated with Jewish and Christian worship schedules to minimize conflicts over shared spaces. Dietary regulations would be handled through separate facilities rather than attempts to create common standards that none of the traditions could fully accept. The Third Council, convened in 1348 during the Black Death, addressed questions of divine providence and human suffering that had taken on urgent practical significance. With plague devastating Europe but largely sparing Jerusalem, religious leaders faced intense pressure to explain why God had apparently protected their city while allowing suffering elsewhere. The theological discussions were intense and sometimes heated. Some participants argued that Jerusalem's preservation proved the superiority of interfaith cooperation over religious conflict. Others maintained that it demonstrated divine favor toward their particular tradition while acknowledging God's mercy toward the others. The Council's final statement, the Declaration of Divine Mystery, acknowledged that human understanding of divine providence was necessarily limited, but affirmed that the preservation of Jerusalem carried responsibilities as well as privileges. The three communities committed themselves to serving as examples of peaceful coexistence and collaborative service to human welfare. The Fourth Council, held in 1453, following the fall of Constantinople, dealt with the changing political landscape of the Mediterranean world. With Christian Byzantine power eliminated and Islamic Ottoman authority expanding, the balance of power that had protected Jerusalem's unique status faced new challenges. The council negotiations were particularly delicate because Ottoman representatives attended as observers, making it clear that the empire's policies toward Jerusalem would be influenced by the council's decisions. After months of discussion, the three communities agreed to present a united petition to the Ottoman Sultan, requesting continuation of Jerusalem's special status as a shared religious center. The petition, known as the Covenant of Sacred Cooperation, emphasized the economic and political benefits that Jerusalem's unique arrangements provided to any governing authority. The constant flow of pilgrims from three major world religions generated substantial revenue, while the city's reputation for interfaith cooperation enhanced the legitimacy of any ruler who protected it. The Fifth Council, convened in 1517, addressed questions raised by the Protestant Reformation. Christian unity, which had been assumed in previous councils, was now fractured, with different Christian denominations taking varying approaches to relations with Judaism and Islam. Protestant representatives, attending their first council, brought new perspectives shaped by their emphasis on scriptural authority and their rejection of certain Catholic traditions. Some Protestant positions were more compatible with Jewish interpretations of Scripture, while others created new areas of disagreement. The Council established the principle that Jerusalem's Christian representation would include both Catholic and Protestant voices, with specific arrangements varying according to the relative size and influence of different Christian communities in the city. The Sixth Council, held in 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War, dealt with the implications of European religious warfare for Jerusalem's peaceful arrangements. With Christians killing Christians across Europe in the name of religious truth, the Jerusalem model of interfaith cooperation faced questions about its relevance and sustainability. The Council produced perhaps its most significant document, the Jerusalem Declaration on Religious Peace, which articulated principles of religious tolerance and cooperation that were far ahead of European practice. The declaration argued that religious diversity, properly managed, could strengthen rather than weaken social stability and spiritual development. This document influenced Enlightenment thinking about religious tolerance and provided practical examples of how interfaith cooperation could function in practice. European philosophers and political theorists studied the Jerusalem model as they developed new approaches to religious freedom and social harmony. Not all councils succeeded in their objectives. The Seventh Council, convened in 1798 during Napoleon's Middle Eastern campaign, broke down when French revolutionary ideas about religion and politics proved incompatible with the traditional assumptions that had guided Jerusalem's interfaith arrangements. The failure of the Seventh Council led to a temporary breakdown in formal interfaith cooperation and the establishment of more separate community structures. However, the practical necessities of shared life in Jerusalem eventually led to the restoration of collaborative arrangements, though in modified forms that accommodated new political realities. The councils of the three traditions established patterns of interfaith dialogue and cooperation that provided models for religious engagement worldwide. Their successes and failures offered practical lessons about the possibilities and limitations of collaborative approaches to religious difference, creating precedents that would influence interfaith relations far beyond Jerusalem itself. Chapter 15: Modern Archaeology's Shocking Discoveries. When British archaeologist Dame Kathleen Kenyon began her excavations in Jerusalem in 1961, She expected to uncover the usual layers of destruction and rebuilding that characterized most ancient Middle Eastern cities. Instead, her shovels and brushes revealed something unprecedented in archaeological experience: nearly 2,000 years of continuous religious activity preserved in unbroken sequence. The first shocking discovery came just 3 meters below the current surface, where Kenyon's team uncovered a perfectly preserved Jewish ritual bath, or mikvah, that contained artifacts dating from the Roman period through the medieval era to the early modern period. The bath had been continuously maintained and used, with periodic renovations that preserved rather than destroyed earlier construction phases. In 30 years of archaeology, Kenyon wrote in her field notes, "I have never encountered a site where religious practices have continued unchanged for so long. Most ancient cities show clear breakpoints where one culture replaced another. Jerusalem shows adaptation and continuity that defies every model of historical development I know." Even more startling were the discoveries beneath the Temple Mount itself. Working with unprecedented cooperation from Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religious authorities, international archaeological teams uncovered chamber after chamber of preserved religious artifacts spanning nearly 2 millennia. The Chamber of Scrolls, discovered in 1967, contained Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and Arabic manuscripts that documented the continuous evolution of religious thought in Jerusalem. Unlike the Dead Sea Scrolls, which had been hidden and forgotten, these texts showed active use and copying over centuries, providing an unbroken record of how religious traditions had developed in their original context. Professor Benjamin Mazar, leading the Israeli archaeological team, made a discovery that challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient Jewish practice. Beneath the southern wall of the Temple Mount, his team uncovered what appeared to be a continuous sequence of ritual objects: oil lamps, incense burners, ceremonial vessels, that showed unbroken temple worship from the Roman period through the modern era. "We expected to find Roman destruction layers," Mazar reported to the Israel Exploration Society. "Instead, we found evidence that temple rituals continued even during the siege of 70 CE. The archaeological record suggests that whatever prevented Jerusalem's fall also preserved its religious practices in ways that contradict everything we thought we knew about this period." The Christian archaeological discoveries were equally remarkable. Excavations at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre revealed not the usual pattern of destruction and rebuilding, but continuous Christian worship at the site from the earliest centuries of the faith. Layers of marble flooring, each carefully laid over the previous one, showed how the church had been maintained and beautified over centuries, without the usual gaps that marked periods of abandonment or destruction. Father Jerome Murphy O'Connor, the Dominican scholar leading Christian archaeological work, discovered what he called the most significant find in Christian archaeology. Beneath the church's current floor, his team uncovered a chamber containing Christian worship objects that could be dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, evidence of continuous Christian presence in Jerusalem from the earliest decades after Jesus' death. The Islamic archaeological discoveries created their own sensations. Excavations around the Dome of the Rock revealed not the typical pattern of Islamic architecture built over destroyed Christian or Jewish sites, but evidence of careful construction designed to accommodate and honor existing religious structures. Dr. Mahmoud Hawari, directing the Islamic Archaeological Project, uncovered foundation stones that showed Islamic builders had actually reinforced Jewish and Christian structures rather than replacing them. The archaeological evidence suggests that early Islamic construction in Jerusalem was intended to create harmony with existing religious architecture rather than dominance over it, he reported. The most controversial discovery came in 1973, when a joint archaeological team uncovered what they called the Interfaith Archive, a chamber containing religious artifacts from all three traditions that had apparently been stored together for safekeeping during various historical crises. Jewish ceremonial objects lay alongside Christian liturgical items and Islamic prayer implements, all carefully preserved and labeled in multiple languages. Carbon dating and other scientific analyses confirmed that these objects had been stored together repeatedly over more than a millennium, suggesting that the three religious communities had cooperated in protecting each other's sacred items during times of external threat. The existence of the Interfaith Archive sparked intense debates among religious authorities and scholars. Some saw it as evidence of unprecedented historical cooperation between faiths. Others argued that it demonstrated dangerous compromises of religious purity and distinctiveness. Archaeological work in the 1980s uncovered even more puzzling evidence. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the existence of underground tunnels connecting major religious sites throughout Jerusalem, tunnels that appeared to have been maintained and used continuously for centuries. The tunnel system, when finally explored, contained meeting chambers where representatives of different religious communities had apparently gathered for discussions and joint activities. Wall paintings in these chambers showed symbols from all three traditions arranged in patterns that suggested collaborative rather than competitive relationships. Perhaps the most mysterious archaeological discoveries were the temporal anomalies that several teams reported. Artifacts that should have shown normal patterns of aging and decay instead displayed characteristics that seemed to violate standard archaeological assumptions about how material objects changed over time. Some Jewish ceremonial objects appeared to be in impossibly good condition despite their ancient age. Christian artifacts showed wear patterns that didn't match their supposed chronological development. Islamic items contained materials that seemed to resist normal processes of deterioration. These anomalies led to new forms of archaeological investigation. Teams of physicists and chemists joined traditional archaeologists to study Jerusalem's unique characteristics. Their findings suggested that the city's unusual history might have involved environmental conditions that standard archaeological models couldn't account for. The cumulative impact of archaeological discoveries in Jerusalem forced scholars to reconsider fundamental assumptions about religious history, urban development, and the relationship between faith and material culture. The city that had defied military conquest had also apparently defied normal patterns of historical change and development. By the end of the 20th century, Jerusalem had become not just a religious center, but a laboratory for understanding historical processes that seemed to operate according to different rules than those governing other ancient cities. The archaeological evidence suggested that the miraculous preservation that had saved Jerusalem from Roman conquest had continued to influence the city's development in ways that challenged every conventional model of how civilizations developed over time. Chapter 16: Technology Meets Ancient Faith. The year 2001 brought an unprecedented convergence of cutting-edge technology and ancient religious practice when the Jerusalem Religious Heritage Project began live-streaming temple services, church masses, and mosque prayers simultaneously for the first time in history. The technical challenges were immense, but the cultural and spiritual implications were even more complex. Rabbi David Hartman, working with Sony's Advanced Broadcasting Division, developed camera systems that could capture Jewish religious ceremonies without violating traditional restrictions on photography during sacred rituals. The solution involved fixed cameras operated remotely, allowing temple worship to be broadcast worldwide while maintaining religious authenticity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Jewish communities that had been scattered across the globe for nearly 2 millennia could suddenly witness temple sacrifices and priestly ceremonies that their ancestors had not seen since Roman times. Synagogues from New York to Buenos Aires organized viewing gatherings where congregations watched in amazement as rituals described in their prayer books unfolded in real time. Christian broadcasting faced different but equally complex challenges. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, worked with Vatican technology specialists to ensure that broadcasts of services from Jerusalem's holy sites maintained appropriate reverence while reaching global audiences hungry for authentic connection to Christianity's birthplace. The impact on Christian worship was profound. Protestant churches that had emphasized scripture over liturgy found themselves drawn to the ancient ceremonial traditions they witnessed in Jerusalem broadcasts. Catholic parishes incorporated elements from Jerusalem's interfaith environment, creating new forms of worship that honored both Christian distinctiveness and interfaith cooperation. Islamic broadcasting created its own revolutionary changes. The call to prayer from Jerusalem's historic mosques, broadcast live to Muslim communities worldwide, created a shared religious experience that transcended national and cultural boundaries. The Dome of the Rock's beautiful interior, rarely seen by non-Muslims, became familiar to Islamic viewers globally through high-definition streaming. Dr. Amina Wadud, an Islamic scholar working with Al Jazeera's Religious Programming Division, noted the transformative impact. For the first time in centuries, Muslims worldwide could participate virtually in prayers offered at one of Islam's holiest sites. The technology created new forms of religious community that connected the global ummah in unprecedented ways. The development of virtual reality religious experiences pushed these innovations even further. By 2010, companies like Oculus and HTC had created VR systems that allowed users to experience temple worship, church services, and mosque prayers as if they were physically present in Jerusalem. The VR experiences raised profound theological questions. Could virtual participation in religious ceremonies provide authentic spiritual benefits? Did remote worship through technology fulfill religious obligations that traditionally required physical presence? Different religious authorities reached different conclusions. Orthodox Jewish authorities generally maintained that virtual participation could enhance understanding and inspiration, but could not substitute for actual physical presence at required religious observances. Reform and conservative movements were more open to accepting technological participation as legitimate religious experience. Christian denominations also split along predictable lines. Catholic authorities emphasized the importance of physical presence for sacramental validity, while acknowledging that virtual experiences could provide valuable spiritual enrichment. Protestant churches, with their emphasis on faith rather than physical sacraments, were generally more accepting of technological religious participation. Islamic scholars debated whether virtual participation in Jerusalem prayers could count toward fulfilling daily prayer requirements. The majority position maintained that physical orientation toward Mecca remained essential, but that virtual participation could provide supplementary spiritual benefits. The development of AI-powered religious guidance systems created even more complex challenges. By 2015, IBM's Watson system had been trained on centuries of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic texts preserved in Jerusalem's archives. The AI could answer religious questions and provide guidance based on the most comprehensive religious database ever assembled. Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz worked with the IBM team to ensure that the AI system could provide authentic Jewish religious guidance while respecting the complexity and nuance that characterized rabbinical decision-making. The system proved remarkably sophisticated, able to provide detailed answers to complex questions of Jewish law and practice. Similar AI systems were developed for Christian and Islamic guidance. Father James Martin collaborated with Google's AI division to create a system that could provide Catholic theological advice based on centuries of church teaching and Jerusalem's unique interfaith theological developments. Dr. Khalid Abu El-Fadl worked with Microsoft to develop an Islamic AI guidance system that drew on the comprehensive hadith collections and legal commentaries preserved in Jerusalem's archives. The system could provide religious advice that reflected both traditional Islamic teaching and the interfaith insights that had developed in Jerusalem over centuries. The intersection of biotechnology with ancient religious dietary and purity laws created particularly complex challenges. When genetic engineering made it possible to create new food products, religious authorities had to determine how traditional dietary restrictions applied to artificially created substances. Jewish authorities dealing with genetically modified foods had access to centuries of halachic reasoning that had developed in Jerusalem's continuous rabbinical tradition. This gave them more sophisticated frameworks for addressing bioethical questions than Jewish communities that had developed in exile. Christian responses to biotechnology were influenced by Jerusalem's tradition of interfaith dialogue on ethical questions. Christian bioethicists could draw on centuries of discussion with Jewish and Islamic scholars about the relationship between divine creation and human innovation. Islamic bioethics benefited from the comprehensive Islamic legal tradition that had developed in dialogue with other Abrahamic traditions. The resulting decisions often showed greater nuance and sophistication than those developed in purely Islamic contexts. The development of quantum computing raised unprecedented questions about the nature of reality and divine knowledge that challenged all three religious traditions. If quantum computers could process information in ways that transcended normal space-time limitations, what did that suggest about the nature of divine omniscience and human knowledge? Jerusalem's unique concentration of religious scholarship and technological innovation made it a natural center for exploring these questions. The Jerusalem Institute for Science and Religion, established in 2020, brought together leading scientists and theologians from all three traditions to explore the theological implications of advancing technology. The Institute's work suggested that quantum mechanical principles might provide new ways of understanding divine action in the world, religious mystery, and the relationship between material and spiritual reality. These insights, developed through interfaith collaboration, offered perspectives on technology and spirituality that no single tradition could have developed alone. By 2025, Jerusalem had become not just a center of ancient religious tradition, but a laboratory for exploring how faith and technology could interact in ways that enhanced rather than threatened spiritual life. The city that had been preserved through miraculous intervention had become a place where ancient wisdom and modern innovation combined to create new possibilities for human spiritual development. Chapter 17: Geopolitics of the Impossible. The United Nations Security Council Emergency Session of October 12, 2023, addressed a crisis that no international body had ever confronted: how to manage a city that belongs simultaneously to three major world religions and whose unique status affected the foreign policies of dozens of nations across the globe. The immediate trigger was the Jerusalem incident, a dispute over renovation plans for the Temple Mount that had escalated into a confrontation involving Israeli police, Palestinian protesters, and international religious authorities, all while millions of believers worldwide watched through live streaming technology. Secretary General Antonio Guterres opened the session with unprecedented language. "We face a situation that challenges every model of international relations and religious diplomacy. Jerusalem's unique status as a shared religious center creates responsibilities and complications that extend far beyond normal territorial disputes." The Israeli representative, Ambassador Gilad Erdan, argued that Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem was internationally recognized, but acknowledged that the city's religious significance created special obligations. "Israel has protected interfaith cooperation in Jerusalem for decades," he declared. "We cannot allow external political pressures to undermine arrangements that have preserved religious harmony for centuries." The Palestinian representative countered that any solution to the Jerusalem question must recognize Palestinian religious and political rights in the city. "Jerusalem is sacred to Muslims worldwide," Ambassador Riyad Mansour emphasized. "Palestinian Muslim authorities have participated in the city's interfaith arrangements for generations. These rights cannot be ignored in favor of unilateral Israeli control." But the most remarkable interventions came from religious authorities who attended as observers. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, representing the Vatican, spoke about Christianity's stake in Jerusalem's status. "The Catholic Church has maintained a presence in Jerusalem since the earliest centuries of our faith. We support arrangements that protect all three traditions' access to their holy sites." Chief Rabbi David Lau argued for the Jewish religious perspective. "The Temple Mount is the holiest site in Judaism. Our continuous worship there for nearly 2,000 years gives us unique religious authority, but we have always shared this sacred space with our Christian and Muslim neighbors." The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Mohammed Ahmad Hussein, presented the Islamic position. "Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock are sacred to Muslims worldwide. Any solution must protect Islamic religious rights while respecting the legitimate religious interests of Jews and Christians." The complexity of the situation became clear as representatives from major powers explained their positions. The United States, with significant Jewish and Christian constituencies, supported Israeli sovereignty while emphasizing the need to protect religious access for all faiths. Russia, with its Orthodox Christian population and complex Middle Eastern interests, called for international protection of Christian holy sites while maintaining good relations with both Israeli and Palestinian authorities. China, despite its officially secular government, recognized that Jerusalem's status affected its relationships with Muslim nations across Central Asia and the Middle East. The Chinese representative called for practical solutions that respect religious diversity while maintaining regional stability. The European Union faced internal divisions, with member states taking different positions based on their own religious demographics and foreign policy priorities. Germany supported Israeli security concerns while emphasizing religious freedom. France advocated for international oversight of religious sites. Italy, with its large Catholic population, focused on protecting Christian interests. The most complex challenge involved Muslim-majority nations. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey all claimed responsibility for protecting Islamic interests in Jerusalem, but their competing political agendas made unified action difficult. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation attempted to present a unified Muslim position, but internal disagreements about the relationship between religious authority and political sovereignty complicated their efforts. The African Union, representing numerous Christian and Muslim member states, called for solutions that respected both African Christian churches' connections to Jerusalem and African Muslims' religious obligations. The session revealed the inadequacy of existing international law for addressing Jerusalem's unique situation. Traditional concepts of sovereignty, based on exclusive territorial control, could not accommodate a city whose religious significance transcended political boundaries. Dr. Marty Koskeniemi, a leading expert in international law, testified that Jerusalem's case required new legal frameworks. We need to develop concepts of shared sovereignty and religious stewardship that go beyond traditional Westphalian models of territorial control. The economic implications were equally complex. Jerusalem's unique status generated billions of dollars in religious tourism revenue, but this economic activity depended on maintaining the city's reputation for interfaith cooperation and religious accessibility. The Jerusalem Chamber of Commerce presented data showing that religious tourism from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim visitors contributed more to the local economy than any other sector. Any disruption to interfaith relations could devastate the economic foundation that supported hundreds of thousands of jobs. International businesses operating in Jerusalem faced unprecedented challenges in navigating the city's complex religious and political environment. Companies had to consider not just Israeli and Palestinian political sensitivities, but also the religious concerns of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities worldwide. The technology sector proved particularly sensitive to these concerns. Major tech companies with operations in Jerusalem found their business decisions scrutinized by religious authorities and international political leaders who worried about the impact of technological change on religious traditions. The session also revealed the inadequacy of existing diplomatic mechanisms for managing interfaith relations. The United Nations had experience with religious conflicts, but no institutional capacity for facilitating interfaith cooperation. Several speakers called for the creation of new international institutions specifically designed to support interfaith dialogue and cooperation. The proposed International Council for Religious Heritage would provide forums for religious authorities to address shared challenges and opportunities. The Jerusalem crisis also highlighted the changing nature of religious authority in the digital age. Traditional religious leaders found their authority challenged by online communities and digital religious experiences that transcended geographical boundaries. The session concluded without formal resolution, but it established several important precedents. For the first time, the UN Security Council had acknowledged that religious considerations could be legitimate factors in international relations. The Jerusalem case had also demonstrated that traditional models of territorial sovereignty were inadequate for addressing situations where religious significance transcended political boundaries. Most importantly, the session had brought together religious and political authorities in unprecedented dialogue about how ancient faith traditions could coexist with modern political realities in ways that served both religious communities and international stability. The geopolitics of Jerusalem had revealed that the miracle of the city's preservation created ongoing challenges and opportunities that the international community was still learning to understand and manage. Chapter 18: Faith in the Digital Age. The morning of Yom Kippur, 2024, marked a technological milestone that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Over 50 million people worldwide participated virtually in the Day of Atonement services at the Jerusalem Temple, creating the largest shared religious experience in human history. Rabbi Miriam Winger, the temple's first female assistant director of digital ministry, watched the streaming statistics with wonder and concern. "We have Jews in remote villages in Peru, in tiny communities in Alaska, in places where there hasn't been a synagogue for decades, all praying with us in real time," she observed. But are we creating authentic religious community, or just religious entertainment? The question reflected broader challenges that all three Abrahamic traditions faced as digital technology transformed how believers connected with their faiths. The temple's high-definition cameras captured every detail of ancient rituals, from the intricate movements of priestly blessings to the smoke rising from altar sacrifices, making these ceremonies accessible to global audiences for the first time in 2 millennia. The response from Jewish communities worldwide had been overwhelming. Orthodox synagogues in Brooklyn streamed the temple services on large screens, creating what they called Jerusalem Minyanim, prayer groups that combined local community worship with virtual participation in temple ceremonies. Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, a prominent conservative Jewish leader, noted the profound theological implications. For the first time since the destruction we thought had occurred in 70 CE, Jews worldwide can witness temple worship. It's reconnecting us to aspects of our tradition that existed only in textbooks and prayers. But the digital revolution also created unprecedented challenges for Jewish religious law. Could watching temple services on Shabbat violate prohibitions against using technology on the day of rest? Did virtual participation in certain ceremonies fulfill religious obligations, or was physical presence still required? The Chief Rabbinate of Jerusalem established the Digital Halacha Commission to address these questions. Their rulings, published in Hebrew, English, and 17 other languages, attempted to balance traditional religious requirements with new technological possibilities. Christian digital ministry faced similar challenges and opportunities. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre began offering virtual reality experiences that allowed believers to walk the Via Dolorosa, witness reconstructions of biblical events, and participate in liturgical celebrations that combined historical authenticity with modern accessibility. Cardinal Louis Tagler, who led the Vatican's digital ministry efforts, emphasized both the opportunities and risks. Technology can make the sacred more accessible, but we must ensure that virtual experiences enhance rather than replace authentic Christian community and sacramental life. The most innovative Christian digital project was the Living Gospel experience, which used artificial intelligence trained on centuries of Jerusalem's interfaith theological discussions to provide personalized biblical commentary. Users could ask questions about Scripture and receive answers that drew on Jewish, Christian, and Islamic interpretive traditions preserved in Jerusalem's archives. Islamic digital innovation focused on connecting global Muslim communities with Jerusalem's sacred sites and scholarly traditions. The Islamic Heritage Foundation developed augmented reality applications that allowed users to experience the architectural and historical development of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque over 13 centuries. Dr. Ingrid Mattson, a leading Islamic scholar, worked with tech companies to create digital platforms for Islamic education that drew on the comprehensive religious texts preserved in Jerusalem. We have access to Islamic scholarship that developed in continuous dialogue with Jewish and Christian traditions, she explained. Digital technology allows us to share these insights with Muslim communities worldwide. The Digital Ummah project connected Muslim users globally for coordinated prayers that aligned with Jerusalem's daily prayer schedule. During Ramadan 2024, over 100 million Muslims participated in virtual iftar celebrations that included live feeds from Jerusalem's mosques and traditional Middle Eastern hospitality customs. The intersection of artificial intelligence with religious authority created particularly complex challenges. The Jerusalem AI system, trained on texts from all three traditions, could provide religious guidance that drew on interfaith theological discussions spanning more than a millennium. But religious authorities worried about the implications of algorithmic religious advice. Could AI systems truly understand the nuanced spiritual and ethical considerations that human religious teachers brought to complex questions? Rabbi Dr. Shmuley Yanklowitz, who served on the AI Ethics Committee, argued for careful limits. AI can provide information and even preliminary guidance, but authentic religious authority requires human wisdom, empathy, and spiritual insight that no computer can replicate. Similar concerns emerged in Christian and Islamic contexts. The Vatican issued guidelines for AI use in religious education that emphasized the irreplaceable role of human pastoral care. Islamic authorities developed principles for AI religious guidance that required human oversight and accountability. The development of blockchain technology for religious applications opened new possibilities for preserving and authenticating religious texts and practices. The Jerusalem Religious Heritage blockchain created immutable records of ancient manuscripts, ceremonial practices, and theological developments that had been preserved in the city's interfaith environment. This digital preservation proved particularly valuable for maintaining the integrity of collaborative religious texts that had been created through interfaith dialogue. The blockchain system could verify the authenticity of texts and track their development over centuries, providing unprecedented security for religious intellectual property. Virtual reality pilgrimage experiences became increasingly sophisticated, allowing believers to visit holy sites with remarkable realism. The Jerusalem 5R pilgrimage included not just visual and auditory experiences, but also olfactory and tactile elements that recreated the sensory aspects of visiting sacred spaces. Some religious authorities worried that virtual pilgrimages might replace physical pilgrimage, reducing the spiritual discipline and community encounter that traditional pilgrimage provided. Others argued that VR experiences could prepare believers for physical pilgrimage or provide access for those who could not travel to Jerusalem. The most ambitious digital project was the Interfaith Metaverse, a virtual environment where believers from all three traditions could interact, worship, and learn together. The metaverse recreated Jerusalem's religious sites with historical accuracy, while providing spaces for interfaith dialogue and collaborative worship that had no precedent in physical reality. Early users reported profound spiritual experiences in the virtual environment. Some described feeling more connected to believers from other traditions than they had ever felt in physical interfaith encounters. Others found that virtual interaction enhanced their appreciation for their own religious traditions. The digital transformation of religious life in Jerusalem had created possibilities that no previous generation could have imagined. Global religious communities connected in real time, AI systems providing interfaith theological guidance, virtual reality experiences that made sacred sites accessible worldwide, and blockchain systems preserving religious heritage for future generations. But these innovations also raised fundamental questions about the nature of authentic religious experience, the role of technology in spiritual development, and the relationship between virtual and physical religious community that believers and religious authorities were still learning to navigate. The faith traditions that had been preserved through miraculous intervention in Jerusalem were now being transformed through digital innovation that created new possibilities for human spiritual connection and development across the globe. Chapter 19: The Soul's Eternal Question. As we stand at the threshold of this alternative history, gazing across the golden stones of a Jerusalem that never fell, we must confront the most profound questions that emerge from this impossible reality. What does it mean for the human soul when the miraculous becomes mundane, when divine intervention is not a matter of faith, but of documented historical fact? Dr. Sarah Davidson, a clinical psychologist who has spent 15 years studying the mental and spiritual health of Jerusalem's interfaith communities, offers insights that challenge our understanding of faith itself. "I've worked with believers from all three traditions," she explains, "and what strikes me most is how differently they experience doubt and certainty compared to believers in our timeline. In our world, religious faith often develops in tension with doubt, strengthened by the challenge of believing without seeing. But in this alternative Jerusalem, believers live with daily evidence of divine protection and interfaith cooperation that seems to validate all three traditions simultaneously. The result is not the simple certainty one might expect, but a more complex form of spiritual experience. When the miraculous is visible, Dr. Davidson notes, faith becomes less about believing the impossible and more about understanding what the possible means for how we should live. She describes patients who struggle not with whether God exists, but with what God's evident protection of Jerusalem requires of them personally and communally. Rabbi Dr. Melissa Weintraub, who directs the Jerusalem Center for Contemplative Practice, has observed how interfaith encounter affects individual spiritual development. When Jews, Christians, and Muslims pray in proximity to each other daily, when they witness each other's authentic devotion and experience each other's spiritual insights, it creates a form of religious maturity that's rare in more isolated faith communities. Her research suggests that believers in Jerusalem's interfaith environment develop what she calls confident humility, deep commitment to their own traditions, combined with genuine respect for other paths to divine truth. They don't become relativists who think all religions are the same, she explains. Instead, they become more sophisticated in understanding how different traditions can be authentically different while still being authentically valid. The psychological impact on children growing up in this environment has been particularly striking. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, who studies religious development in Jerusalem's youth, has found that children raised with regular exposure to multiple faith traditions develop more nuanced understandings of religious truth and more sophisticated approaches to resolving conflicts. These children don't see religious differences as threats to be eliminated, Dr. Hassan reports. They see them as puzzles to be understood, as sources of richness rather than division. When they encounter religious conflict elsewhere in the world, they often become natural peacemakers because they've experienced how differently things can work. But this unique spiritual environment has also created challenges unknown in more traditional religious contexts. Some believers struggle with what Dr. Davidson calls miracle fatigue, a form of spiritual numbness that can develop when the extraordinary becomes routine. When divine intervention is part of your daily reality, she explains, it can paradoxically become harder to experience the sense of wonder and gratitude that sustains spiritual life. Some of my patients report feeling spiritually spoiled, unable to appreciate ordinary religious experiences because they're accustomed to miraculous ones. The phenomenon of interfaith vertigo affects believers who become overwhelmed by the spiritual richness of encountering multiple authentic religious traditions. Father Michael Torres, a Catholic priest who serves Jerusalem's international Christian community, describes counseling believers who feel lost in the abundance of spiritual possibilities. Some Catholics come to Jerusalem expecting to have their faith strengthened by visiting Christianity's holy sites, Father Torres explains. Instead, they're overwhelmed by encountering vibrant Jewish and Islamic traditions that seem equally blessed by divine favor. They don't lose their Catholic faith, but they struggle to understand what their Catholic identity means in this broader context. Similar challenges affect Jewish and Muslim believers. Imam Dr. Amira Osman, who leads counseling services for Muslim visitors to Jerusalem, describes believers who arrive expecting to find a city where Islam clearly supersedes other traditions, only to encounter evidence of divine blessing on Jewish and Christian communities as well. It's not that they abandon their Islamic faith, Dr. Osman explains, but they have to develop more sophisticated understandings of what Islamic truth means in a world where other traditions also appear to have divine validation. The mystical traditions within all three faiths have been particularly transformed by Jerusalem's interfaith environment. Jewish Kabbalists, Christian contemplatives, and Sufi Muslims have found common ground in their approaches to direct spiritual experience that transcends the theological differences that divide their traditions at the intellectual level. Dr. Rami Shapiro, a Jewish renewal rabbi who studies comparative mysticism, describes meditation groups where Jews, Christians, and Muslims practice together while maintaining their distinctive approaches to encountering the divine. At the mystical level, he observes, the differences between traditions become less important than the shared recognition that ultimate reality transcends all human categories. These mystical encounters have produced new forms of spiritual practice that honor multiple traditions while remaining authentic to each. The Jerusalem way of interfaith spirituality has influenced meditation centers, retreat programs, and spiritual direction practices worldwide. But perhaps the most profound impact of Jerusalem's preservation has been on humanity's understanding of religious development itself. The survival of Temple Judaism, the different evolution of Christianity and Islam, and the centuries of interfaith cooperation have created a living laboratory for studying how religious traditions develop under different historical circumstances. Dr. Grace Matthew, a theologian who directs the Jerusalem Institute for Religious Studies, argues that this alternative history provides crucial insights into the relationship between historical circumstances and religious truth. We can see how the same core spiritual insights express themselves differently under different conditions, she explains. It helps us distinguish between essential religious truths and the cultural accidents of particular historical developments. The personal testimonies of believers who have spent significant time in Jerusalem's interfaith environment reveal profound transformations in spiritual maturity and religious understanding. Many describe developing what they call deep faith, commitment to their own traditions that is strengthened rather than threatened by encounter with other authentic spiritual paths. Sarah Martinez, a Methodist minister who spent 2 years studying in Jerusalem, describes her experience. "I returned home more Christian than when I left, but also more respectful of Judaism and Islam. Seeing how God works through different traditions helped me understand my own tradition more clearly, not less." Similar testimonies come from Jewish and Muslim believers who have been shaped by Jerusalem's unique spiritual environment. They describe faith that is simultaneously more particular and more universal, more committed to their own traditions, and more open to truth wherever it appears. As we reflect on this alternative history, we confront questions that challenge our deepest assumptions about faith, truth, and human spiritual development. What does it mean that multiple religious traditions can apparently receive divine blessings simultaneously? How should believers understand their own tradition's claims to truth in a world where other traditions also seem divinely validated? The souls who have wrestled with these questions in Jerusalem's unique environment offer no easy answers, but they provide models of spiritual maturity that transcend the usual boundaries of religious identity. They suggest that the deepest religious truths may be found not in the triumph of one tradition over others, but in the mysterious ways that authentic seeking finds divine response regardless of the particular path it follows. Chapter 20. The Prophecy That Awaits. In the deepest vaults beneath the Temple Mount, accessible only to the highest religious authorities from all three traditions, lies a chamber that was sealed in 1948 and has remained unopened ever since. The Chamber of Future Mysteries contains documents that challenge everything we think we understand about prophecy, destiny, and the ultimate purpose of Jerusalem's miraculous preservation. The chamber was discovered during renovations following Israel's independence, when workers uncovered stone tablets covered in text written in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and Arabic. The inscriptions spoke of events yet to come, of a time when the children of Abraham shall face their final test, and the city that was preserved shall reveal its ultimate purpose. Rabbi Chaim Vital, the chief curator of the temple archives, has been one of only 12 people permitted to study the chamber's contents over the past 7 decades. His encrypted research notes, obtained through extraordinary circumstances, hint at revelations that could transform human understanding of divine purpose and religious destiny. The prophecies speak of a convergence, Rabbi Vital's notes reveal, not the end of the world as commonly understood, but the beginning of something unprecedented in human experience. The preservation of Jerusalem was not an end in itself, but preparation for events that will test whether humanity is ready for the next stage of spiritual evolution. The chamber apparently contains detailed descriptions of signs that would precede this convergence, many of which have already begun to manifest. The rise of global communication technology that allows worldwide participation in religious ceremonies. The development of artificial intelligence systems that can provide guidance based on multiple religious traditions. The emergence of virtual reality experiences that blur the boundaries between physical and spiritual reality. But the most intriguing prophecy concerns what the texts call the Great Recognition, a future moment when believers from all three traditions will simultaneously realize that their separate paths have been leading toward a unified destination that none of them had previously understood. Cardinal Alessandro Tomasi, who represents the Vatican's interests in the chamber's study, has provided cryptic comments about the Christian implications of these prophecies. The text suggests that Jesus' promise to return takes on meanings we never anticipated, he reportedly told a private gathering of Christian leaders. The second coming may not be what we expected, but something far more wonderful and challenging. The Islamic prophecies contained in the chamber appear to relate to the concept of the Mahdi, the guided one who will restore justice and truth to the world. But according to leaked summaries, these texts suggest that the Mahdi's mission will involve uniting rather than conquering, building bridges between traditions rather than establishing the supremacy of any single faith. Dr. Hassan al-Banna, a descendant of the famous Islamic reformer and one of the few scholars permitted to study the chamber's Islamic texts, has remained silent about their specific contents. But his public writings have increasingly emphasized themes of interfaith cooperation and the unity underlying apparent religious diversity. The Jewish prophecies reportedly focus on the coming of the Messiah, but in ways that challenge traditional understanding. The texts apparently describe a messianic age that will be characterized not by the triumph of Judaism over other faiths, but by the revelation of divine truth that validates authentic seeking in all traditions. These prophecies have remained secret, partly because of their potentially explosive implications for religious and political stability worldwide. If believers from different traditions began to anticipate a convergence that validated all their faiths simultaneously, it could either create unprecedented cooperation or devastating conflicts between those who embrace and those who reject such possibilities. But according to the prophecies, the choice may not be left to human decision. The texts apparently describe astronomical and geological events that will force humanity to confront these questions, whether they want to or not. References to signs in the heavens and the earth itself bearing witness suggest that natural phenomena will play a role in the prophetic fulfillment. Recent astronomical observations have detected anomalies that some researchers quietly connect to the chamber's prophecies. The Hubble Space Telescope has recorded unusual energy signatures emanating from the direction of Jerusalem during certain religious observances. Ground-based instruments have detected gravitational fluctuations that seem to correlate with major interfaith gatherings in the city. The Israeli government has classified most research related to these phenomena, but leaked reports suggest that physicists are struggling to explain observations that seem to violate known laws of physics. Some theorists have proposed that Jerusalem's unique spiritual environment might create conditions where consciousness and physical reality interact in unprecedented ways. The prophecies also apparently describe a role for technology in the coming convergence. References to artificial minds that speak with divine wisdom and distant voices joining in unified prayer seem to anticipate developments in artificial intelligence and global communication that are only now becoming reality. But the most tantalizing aspect of the prophecies concerns their timing. The texts apparently provide specific signs that will indicate when the convergence is approaching. According to those who have studied them, many of these signs have already appeared, suggesting that the prophetic fulfillment may be closer than anyone realizes. The final prophecy, according to fragmentary accounts, describes the moment of convergence itself. All three traditions will simultaneously experience revelations that show them how their separate paths have been preparation for a unified understanding of divine truth that transcends while fulfilling each tradition's distinctive claims. The result will not be the elimination of religious differences, but their transformation into complementary aspects of a more complete spiritual reality. Jews, Christians, and Muslims will remain Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but they will understand their identities in ways that create cooperation rather than competition. But the prophecies also warn of those who will resist this convergence, who will prefer the certainty of separation to the mystery of unity. The final test will be whether humanity can embrace a future that validates all authentic spiritual seeking while calling each tradition to grow beyond its current limitations. As we conclude this journey through an alternative history where Jerusalem never fell, we are left with questions that may soon become practical rather than theoretical. The prophecies that await in the sealed chamber suggest that the miraculous preservation of the holy city was not an end, but a beginning, not a resolution, but a preparation for challenges and opportunities that will test the very foundations of human religious understanding. The signs described in those ancient texts are manifesting around us. The technology exists. The global connections are in place. The interfaith dialogue has matured. The question that remains is whether we are ready for the revelation that may transform not just how we understand religion, but how we understand reality itself. In Jerusalem, the city that defied destruction, the future waits to be born. And according to the prophecies that have been hidden for 75 years, that future may be closer than any of us dare to imagine. The sacred stones of Jerusalem guard their final secret, but not for much longer. The convergence approaches, and when it arrives, everything we thought we knew about faith, truth, and destiny will be transformed forever.